And I think in that instance, in a rare instance, Alex doesn't normally do this, but in a rare instance, I think he has put his emotions before his logic. He's kind of got him backwards. Because saying, even if there is evidence, it's not the kind of evidence I want. Lately, I've been watching a lot of Alex O'Connor videos. He's a atheist YouTuber, and I think he's got fascinating arguments. He's a fascinating guy. He knows Christianity really well, but he just comes down on the opposite side I do. He's an atheist, I'm a Christian, and through watching his videos, I've by no means watched all of his videos. So if I miss a point, I apologize. But watching a lot of his videos, I have come to a couple main points that he finds are the most objectionable reasons to not believe in Christianity. For instance, there's this one video that he did called Why I Don't Believe in God. And so I kind of want this to be a response to that video and to take a look at the main 3 reasons he gives for why he doesn't believe in Christianity. I will have linked below his talk of why I don't believe in Christian, or why I don't believe in God, I think is what it's called. And you can go watch that first and then come back here if you want, or I'm going to do my best to summarize each and every one of his arguments in a way that is fair to his arguments before I give my counter arguments, just so that you can be aware. But if you want to go watch that video first, you can, and then come back here. So his 3 main arguments are this. 1, God is hidden. So he's not visible, like Christians say, he's hidden. Geography is indicative of religious belief. And 3, there's grotesque suffering in the world. Those are his 3 main arguments. And in other videos, I've seen him talk about how these are kind of the sticking points for him, especially point 3, grotesque suffering and related to animal suffering, which we'll get to close to the end of the video. So let's start with the hiddenness of God. And the reason he starts with this is because he's actually starting with a counter argument to a common Christian argument for the existence of God. Christians often say God is clearly visible in all of creation. We call it the watchmaker argument, or the argument of intelligent design. It's this idea that you can look at the world and it's designed so precisely that you can't help but think there was a designer. If there's a watch, there has to be a watchmaker. If there's a world, there has to be a world creator, a universe creator. Therefore, God exists. But Alex O'Connor's counter argument to that is actually God is hidden to people who are unresistant, meaning people who don't believe in Christianity aren't just those who don't want to believe. There's actually people like Alex O'Connor says himself, he wants to believe in a God of love, but he's just not convinced one actually exists. And so he categorizes himself not as a resistant non-believer, but as a non-resistant non-believer. And his question is, if God is truly a God of love, why would he not explicitly reveal himself to non-resistant non-believers? They're like, yeah, I want to know you, just show me yourself. And God doesn't answer. That's his main argument. I want to believe, but I don't. So I think it's a really well thought out question. It's actually, I've never heard anyone else make this argument before. And so I think it's a really nuanced argument. It's a good argument. But here's my counter argument. And this first part is a small point, but I do think it's worth making, is that people don't know themselves as well as they think they do. For anyone who has grown in their self-awareness, you'll look back at yourself 5 years previously and you'll say, oh my goodness, I did not know myself at all. I can't believe I did and said that stuff, because you've become more self-aware. You know your own motives more now than you did back then. Yeah, your motives were mixed and you didn't realize they were mixed back then, but now you can see them clearly. I think there's a very big possibility that people who call themselves a non-resistant non-believer, like Alex, there's actually hidden motives inside that you can't possibly uncover to say, oh, I am purely motivated by my desire to believe that there's a God, but I just can't come to that conclusion logically. So I think it is overstating a little bit to make a blanket statement claim that, yes, I know for a fact that every single one of my desires internally is for a God of love to exist, but intellectually, I can't get myself there. I don't know if you can honestly make that claim, or if anyone can honestly make that claim. So that's kind of my first thing. That's not my main argument against that, but I do think it's worth bringing up for those of us who have grown in self-awareness, like myself in high school. Complete fool Still a fool. But yeah, it's worth noting that we all grow in our level of self-awareness. There's that. But I also think that O'Connor specifically is more resistant than he realizes. Because when we say non-resistant, we don't just mean non-resistant to the existence of God as a whole concept. We also mean non-resistant to the method that God has chosen to reveal himself, which for instance is creation and scripture and Jesus coming in the flesh 2,000 years ago. This is what we call revelation. What Alex is saying is, no, that's not good enough for me. He thinks that God needs to be more revelatory than he is now. He hasn't revealed himself enough. So he's actually resistant to God's method of revelation. Now, I do feel like he would make a counter argument if, say, he were right here. He would say, well, now you're just arguing against logic. So should we just toss out logic and we don't use logic when thinking about God? Of course, I'm not saying that. If I were saying that, this whole video would be pointless because I'm using logic to argue for the existence of God against atheism here. But what I'm saying is there are plenty of other people who do find the evidence of God compelling enough to believe. Scientists, philosophers, everyday Christians. There are people who have been convinced by the evidence. But what Alex O'Connor specifically said in this video of why I don't believe in God, he says he's never had this transcendent emotional experience that he wants to convince him that God exists. Just the evidence that we have laid out. Jesus's life and the historical accounts of it and the historical criticism used to verify that they are historical accounts. That plus the existence of the universe and its complexities and all of its richness, all of the moral and philosophical arguments that lend themselves in support of Christianity being true. He's just saying that's not enough. I need a personal feeling. And I think in that instance, in a rare instance, Alex doesn't normally do this, but in a rare instance, I think he's put his emotions before his logic. He's kind of got him backwards. Because saying, even if there is evidence, it's not the kind of evidence I want. And so that in a sense, I'm not trying to pick a fight or anything like that, but I do think it's perhaps he's being a resistant non-believer. He's not actually being a non-resistant non-believer. That's my critique of his first point. Okay, the second main point is also really interesting. He argues that atheism better explains the current spread of religion across the world. For instance, he'll say that Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and Thailand is 95% Buddhist. You've got one religion that's not monotheistic, and then you've got another religion, Islam, in Saudi Arabia, that's completely monotheistic, and they are culturally determined religions. You believe it because you were born into that culture. And so he says that atheism better accounts for that than does Christianity. If a God of love exists, you would expect monotheism to be prevalent in every culture. That's his argument. I think it's another good observation. I don't agree with it, but I do think it's a well thought out question and a well thought out argument. But here's why I disagree. First, I don't think this is actually an argument that supports atheism, because you can make the same claim about Christianity. Theologically, you can make the same claim. Here's what I mean. For example, Christianity teaches that God made men and women in his image, in the image of God. He created them male and female. But it also teaches that we as humanity fell. We failed, we sinned, and therefore we became corrupted. And so what happens when we become corrupted is we begin worshiping the creation instead of the creator. We begin attaching ultimate importance to things instead of to God. And because humans are most like God, we share in his likeness more than any other creation, we most of the time will put humans in the center of that worship because we are most like God. And so what happens when religion begins to morph to people's desires instead of the truth, and you have this emphasis on family that is very clear in scripture. It is God's design that faith would be passed down from one generation to the next, that your family would be the most influential part of your life. Your parents have more influence on you than any other person in your life. That's God's design. And so if you have individual families that have a desire and they put something else in the center of worship instead of God, that begins to spread. A family becomes a village, becomes an entire culture. And now you have a culture where their religion is matching their desires, and that quickly spreads, and it is kept within a certain culture, and they can develop separately, just like languages. Languages develop with distance based on just the needs of the people groups, right? So you have hundreds of dialects in China. So I spent 3 years in China, and all I learned was Mandarin, and they have hundreds, I think thousands of other dialects, and dialects can spring about from if a people group gets separated by a mountain, they live on two opposite sides of the mountain for 200 years, boom, their language develops differently, and they have two different dialects very quickly because of the needs of the situation. Same with religion and needs. If they have set their desires as the most important, it develops based on what they need very quickly. And so you have all these religions that are developing based on the cultural norms, cultural needs, cultural desires of certain people groups. Now you have a very good explanation for why one culture could have primarily one set of beliefs and another culture have a completely different set of beliefs. This is not an argument for Christianity at all, because Alex just made the same argument with atheism. I just think it's a non-starter. I don't think this argument can be used because any worldview that can explain this situation away, I just think it's a wash. It's a zero-sum game where, okay, atheism can account for it, Christianity can account for it. Who's right? Well, if the God of the Bible exists, then Christianity is right. If he doesn't exist, then atheism's right. It's really, I don't think it's a good argument either way. But here's what I do think is a good argument for Christianity against atheism. So Pew Research does a lot of good research, and what they found, I'm actually going to pull up the chart real quick. I'll put it on the screen for a second. This was from 2014, so this is the most recent data I could find of religious diversity around the world. If you look at areas around the world and each major religion and their presence in those areas, if you take a look at this and you say Asia Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, North America, Latin America, and Middle East, North Africa, all of those have a Christian presence. Islam has 3 out of the 6, 4, I guess you could say 4, with 6% in Europe. You've got unaffiliated, you've got Hindus primarily in Asia Pacific, you've got Buddhists, also primarily Asia Pacific, you got folk religion, also primarily Asia Pacific. And so you see a greater spread Christianity both across locations and people groups. So for instance, people will say Islam is on the rise in Europe. That's true, but it's not spanning cultural gaps. If Christianity is true, and if there is a God of love who exists, what you would expect that the religion that best represents him would be cross-cultural at its core. It would be malleable to any culture, but at the same time, it would also challenge every culture in specific ways. Because look, again, you have to look at the twofold theological concept of Christianity. One, we're all made in the image of God. Therefore, every culture, the people of every culture are made in the image of God. And so they will relate to God in a way where if Christianity is true, Christianity will fit into their culture so that they can worship the God who made them. On the flip side, every culture is fallen because all people have sinned. All of humanity is fallen, and therefore Christianity is going to critique every single culture in certain ways, not the same way in every culture, but it will critique every culture in certain ways. And so you have this cross-cultural nature of Christianity, but it also doesn't fit any one culture perfectly. Could you possibly say that Christianity fits America perfectly? No, especially when you look at cultural Christians versus practicing Christians, I would say, is cultural Christians, they take a little bit of Christianity and unfortunately most of them a little bit of conservatism, and they tie them together. Genuine Christianity both critiques and affirms certain aspects of that type of cultural Christianity. What would we expect if a God of love existed, if we were made in his image, but we were also fallen? We would expect that he would meet us where we are as people, but he would also not want us to stay there. He would want to help us improve and be better because he loves us. And that's exactly what you see in Christianity. And you see Christianity more than any other religion by far is cross-cultural. And this chart shows it, and it's from 2014. Christianity has been growing like wildfire in Asia Pacific and the Middle East in the past 10 years. So these stats are probably under-supported, but even if we don't take that into account, it's still the most represented religion across all people groups by far. And that's what you would expect if a religion were accurately representing a God of love who exists. And that's what we see. So O'Connor's last point is regarding grotesque suffering, and particularly animal suffering. And there's two aspects of this argument. One, he says there's far more suffering than there needs to be. Right? Sure, he gets that certain suffering makes sense because it grows character, but then there's also suffering that has no intrinsic value that we can see. So why would it exist? Yes, I get suffering for my own failures, but why would I suffer because of a hurricane or things like that? Natural disasters is just one example of grotesque, seemingly illogical suffering if a God of love exists. So that's his first point. And then his second point is it seems like the animal kingdom is founded on suffering. How can that exist with a God of love? How could a God of love create an ecosystem where trillions, literally trillions of animals are suffering? So that's his third point. Again, it's a very well thought out, very interesting point. I disagree. Here's why. First, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, he's really, I think we need to go the logical side first, because he's really disproved this idea that suffering is antithetical or it's contradictory to the existence of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God. He has conclusively proven that is not a logical contradiction. He's proved that conclusively. In his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, it's a little bit older. And if you really want to get humbled, and if you just want to feel stupid, read that book. Yeah, it's only 100 pages, but I'm telling you, if you just want to take a little bite of humble pie, read that book, 100 pages. It'll take you a couple weeks at least. It's a doozy, but it's really good. And it has been so influential in philosophical circles that people really don't claim that it is a logical inconsistency to both believe in an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God and the existence of suffering. So that's the logical side of thing that we have to deal with. Christianity actually takes one step further. It doesn't just say, hey, it's not logically inconsistent. It also says, when God sent Jesus to earth, the Son of God, God incarnate, the God-man, as we like to say from Athanasius, the God-man Jesus Christ. When he came to earth and he decided to die on the cross, he didn't just suffer for us, he also suffered with us. So it's this idea that we do not know why certain instances of suffering happen. And if anyone claims that they know that so-and-so's son or daughter died for character development of the parent, they are insane. Insane. You can't say that. That is the most heartless, brutal thing. And I hope that Christians aren't walking around making those kind of claims. We can't possibly know why something so atrocious like that would happen. A thoughtful Christian hopefully will not make that claim because we can't know. But what we do know is that God isn't doing it because he doesn't care. Because he sent his son, Jesus, to die on the cross, to suffer for us on our behalf, but also with us. If Christianity is true, then the God of the universe sacrificed perfection. He sacrificed an eternity in heaven away from all suffering, shame, pain, any of that. He could have just said, nope, humanity did this to themselves. I don't need this. No, he came to earth. He condescended to earth and he suffered alongside of us so that we don't know why specific acts of suffering happen. We can't, but we know it's not because God doesn't care. He showed us his trustworthiness in that even if we can't understand why suffering happens, he does have a reason for allowing it. We can trust that because of the character of Jesus, because of what he did. And so Christianity is unlike any other religion. Only Christianity says God came to earth and suffered. The God of the universe came to earth and suffered. That is completely uniquely Christian. And because of that, we can take comfort and we can have hope in our suffering, even if we don't understand why it's happening. That's the claim of Christianity. And I think it's an incredibly beautiful claim. It's probably the most beautiful doctrine in Christianity that I know of. And not only that, not only does he suffer with us, but we have hope in following him because he's also promised that one day he will wipe away every tear. He will defeat death itself. Pain and death will be no more. So that's the hope of Christianity. And it does address suffering, even though people want to claim that it doesn't address suffering. What about the animal kingdom? Why would it be founded on suffering? What's the deal with that? And this is where I want to make an interesting point that's been made before. I don't think it's been made very well, though, by Christian apologists, people who defend the faith. What is consciousness? We still do not have a good answer for that. I was a psych major in college. I've done more research since. We have no idea what consciousness actually is. Where is it housed? Is it actually housed in the brain? Yeah, I mean, hopefully, probably. Is it even material? We can't prove whether consciousness is material or not. As 21st century scientists, we can't prove that. We have so little understanding of human consciousness that it seems a little silly to me to make one of the primary arguments against Christianity and be animal suffering. Why do I say that? Well, think about this. Where does suffering in humans reside? My argument is it resides in your consciousness. For example, I broke my femur in middle school. It was the most excruciating experience of my life. Awful. Like, I don't know how to say it. Just awful. It was terrible. I stayed at home for a couple weeks from school. I think it was 7th grade. And, you just sit there and you think about your pain and it just makes it hurt more. Right. So, one of my teachers gave me a Rubik's Cube, and let me play with it, while I was injured. And while I was learning how to solve a Rubik's Cube, I didn't have pain anymore. I completely forgot about my leg. And so my question is, where did that suffering reside? Well, it resided in my consciousness, because as soon as my consciousness changed from being about my leg to solving a Rubik's Cube, this complex problem, I didn't have that pain anymore. Another example, in high school, who else stayed home to play video games when they were sick? Sick. When I would stay home and play video games, I didn't feel bad anymore. I didn't feel sick anymore. I was legitimately sick, but I didn't even think about it. Why? Because video games were so much more fun. My mom would walk upstairs. She'd be like, "You're not sick. You look great. You're playing video games." I'm like, well, yeah, I'm distracted. It's this idea that pain is experienced in your consciousness. It's not just your pain receptors go off and you immediately feel pain. And so for the animal kingdom, when we're assuming that animals suffer the same way we do in their consciousness, we're assuming that we understand our own consciousness and then we're applying it to animals. When in reality, there's no basis for that. Like I said at the beginning, we don't even understand our own consciousness. So how could we possibly assume we understand animals and therefore how they feel pain? So Alex O'Connor, he really doesn't like this counter argument because he says it's a Cartesian fantasy, as I'm quoting him from some video. And his argument is, if we believe this, that animals don't feel pain, they don't suffer in the same way that we do, then it's going to lead us to treat them more poorly. And that very well may be the case, but since when do we decide truth claims based on utility? So what he's saying is we must believe that animals feel pain so that we don't mistreat them. And that's backwards. That's like me saying, I must believe that I won this argument, I won this debate that I created against Alex O'Connor in order to feel good about myself. Well, it may make me feel bad about myself, but that doesn't mean that I must have won. It's just backwards. And so I do agree as a Christian and as someone who believes that we should steward the world well, that we should care for animals. So, but just because we lose the argument that animals feel pain doesn't mean we completely lose the argument that we should treat animals well. Sure, we may lose that one argument, but there's other reasons to treat them well. Well, think about this. People don't mistreat their cars or their houses just because those things feel pain. They treat them well because they know that it will help them and their families in their flourishing. And so in the same way, you can apply that same criteria to animals and you say, it's actually really good that we treat this world well for our own human flourishing. You don't need the argument animals feel pain, therefore that's the only reason that we're going to treat them well. No, I know a lot of people that treat their cars really well. They wash them like every day. I'm like, why are you washing your car today? It's going to rain in like 2 hours. But it's this stewardship. It's this desire to treat things well because it's yours and it belongs to you and you need to take care of it in order for you as a person to have a better life. And I think it's the same way for all of humanity. So there's still good arguments to be made. We're not losing the argument to treat animals well just because we lose that one argument. Those don't equate. And again, I feel like he's making an argument from emotion, not from logic. But hey, let's say you're unconvinced by the fact that animals don't suffer. That's fine. I'm not totally convinced by it either, even though I'm the one making the argument, because like I said, you just can't know. We don't even understand our own consciousnesses. We can't possibly know exactly what animals are experiencing. My thing was just that shouldn't be a main reason you reject Christianity or the existence of God based on something like that we understand so little of. But my other argument is the sad truth of the world and of how the world works, and Christianity teaches us too, is that other people suffer based on someone's mistakes, faults, sins. And the Bible teaches that animals suffer. There is I'm suffering quotes because again, we don't actually know, but animals suffer because of the choices of humans. Think about this. When leaders make bad choices, leaders don't typically suffer. It's their people that suffer. Think about the US economy. When they printed all of that money and they continue to print money, we felt that in America. We felt the inflation. Inflation is crazy. It's come down a little bit, but it has affected all of us. What's even worse, this is for us in America, this is our country. Like we live here, we get to vote, we get to decide to some small degree who's leading the country. Very, very small. But we get something. What about the people in developing countries? They don't get a say in what America does at all. And you know what our printing money did to them? Their experience of inflation was 10 times worse than ours. The US dollar has so much influence on the global economy that when the dollar inflates, it affects every major market in the world. And so the decisions of American politics, and quite frankly, the American people who think that all their problems are going to be solved by getting a $2,000 stimulus check, sorry, being honest, it results in affecting global economies. That's a really sad truth that many, many people went hungry a lot because of what American politicians decided to do with money. If you apply that to our current situation, when Adam and Eve decided to go their own way, to worship the creation instead of the creator, they allowed sin to enter the world, and them as leaders of the world. Here's how it was set up in Genesis chapter 1. Adam and Eve were set up to be the stewards of God's creation. They were meant to be his representatives on earth. They were supposed to be, in a sense, God to creation. They were his, you could say, viceroys, or they were his ambassadors. They were representing him on earth as having his image. That's why saying they're in his image, it actually has a functional aspect to it. They were to function in the leadership role that God had given them on earth. And when they failed as leaders and they decided to follow their own path against the will of God, sin entered the world, suffering entered the world, and it caused dire consequences. And you say, it's not the animal's fault. That's exactly right. It's not. It's the fault of humankind for being the kind of leaders who made mistakes that caused suffering for others. So even this idea of animal suffering points to a really, really important point. Our sin, according to Christianity, according to the Bible, is far, far worse than we even imagine. It's far more grotesque than we even imagine. I agree that the grotesqueness of human suffering is astonishing, and it points to the grossness of sin. That's what the Bible's trying to get at. Don't come at me and say I'm calling who and who's sinful. I'm not trying to do that, but I'm just saying this is what the Bible teaches, that we are far more sinful than we could have ever imagined. But at the same time, that's what makes Jesus's suffering and his suffering in our place, on our behalf, that much more radical. Because we're not just far more sinful than we even dared imagine, but we're also far more loved than we ever dared hope. And so it's that double-edged sword of yes, the news of the Bible it's hard news. It's hard to swallow. It's offensive sometimes. It's offensive to me, but at the same time, it brings so much hope that you can be that messed up and yet that loved all at the same time. So I don't know if I did a good job in responding to O'Connor's arguments. Hope I made a good few points. That's for you to decide. Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments, whatever you want to do. Thanks for watching, fools. See you next time.